So one of the aspects that's become a new phenomenon, especially for incoming athletic directors, is not only bringing in their own people a lot of times, but this kind of idea of or notion of cleaning house. I don't know how much you've seen of it, but it just seems like there are a lot of people that either did not understand the functionality of getting into athletics to begin with at the lower levels, or they just decided to retire on the job, or whatever it is, or there's people at the top that don't seem to want to wait and manage and mentor, so therefore they're willing to move those folks out. I mean, is there a delicate balance that you have to kind of work there?
Troy, that's such a great question. It's an amazing phenomenon when you're hired to be a change agent. Okay, I was hired in 2003 to be a change agent. We took an athletic program that won one conference championship to 42 after I left. We had 24 in the last 2 years alone. I talked to you about the fundraising piece. I mean, the facility improvements, the cultural improvement. So there's really two ways to change a culture, and the core way is to change the people there that don't believe in what you're doing and or what you're trying to do. And so what happens is, I fired 75 people of 110 in my first 4 years, and that was very hard. It took a lot out of me, but I had to do it to build it. Our athletic program went from 268 in the Sears Cup to 286 to 68 when I left, and College World Series and FCS football, beating Army and the lacrosse team overtime goal to the Final Four and in 24 conference championships in 2 years. It's the golden era there when I left. But what people don't realize is the prior 5 years, you're letting go and firing and counseling and serving as a professional therapist for a lot of people. And what happens, Troy, and this happens every single day, and I go back to this, every decision's 50-50. When you make a change in personnel, inevitably the person is going to be unhappy, right? They're going to sit in the weeds and wait, and they wait, and they wait, and they wait for a mistake to happen, or they wait for somebody else to come out and attack you. And when I was at Stony Brook, we had made a lot of changes and a lot of unhappy people, but you really couldn't debate the success we were having on every level, fundraising to athletic success. And then once there's a kink in the armor, those people come out of the woodworks. And it goes back to anonymous blogs, anonymous notes, anonymous tweets, things like that. And all of a sudden, you go from being on top of the hill to being at the bottom of the hill, and now you're under siege. And it's hard. It's hard for people. But I go back to being, fearless. Once you become fearless as an athletic director, life and your job becomes limitless. And you have to go into a situation and be fearless that you can't worry about what others say or think, because that will set you back. So once you become fearless, ultimately life becomes limitless for you and your career becomes limitless for you. And it goes back to when that person wants to, when somebody makes an accusation, or when somebody accuses, or when somebody complains about a coach, or when somebody complains about how you allocated, or a faculty member's complaining because his or her program got reduced by X million dollars, but the athletic program is, flying to Italy for summer for basketball. The president has to be strong enough to stand up and say, I got your back. And that's what makes the difference between bad athletic director jobs and good athletic director jobs, is the fact that you speak in one voice from a university's perspective about athletics. You debate behind closed doors, but ultimately you speak in one voice. And too many of my friends and too many people out there feel like they're on an island these days, and are really looking to survive to their next contract. And that's not a healthy way to live. And I'm telling you that from a consulting perspective. Haven't been consulting for the last 2 years, and I've been consulting I'm on a retainer from the 76ers, from the New Jersey Devils. In my current position as a president, partner, CEO of Dynamic Sports Management, I can tell you that across the spectrum of sport, that's a reality. And the reality is that it's very vulnerable, it's very visible, and it's highly volatile. And volatile because at any given time the floor can fall out from under you for any given reasons. And like you said, an 18-year-old kid might get in the car and drink and drive and hit a tree. God forbid. Kids make mistakes. There's temptation in this world. People make mistakes. And the extent to which those mistakes don't bring down the infrastructure of the athletic program is built on the culture that you built as an athletic department.
But does that mean that the majority of staff should all be on contracts? I mean, the athletic director's on contracts, but typically below them, especially that internal staff, non-coaching staff, aren't. And that's where some of the problems especially lie, because you might have somebody who stays there for 25 years and just kind of plays a game of Outlast, but becomes almost a roadblock. Is it better to have everybody on contract to where they know where exactly they stand at all times?
That's a great question. It depends what institution. I mean, public institutions tend to have unions, and so you deal with the union issue across the board. So that was a challenge for us at Stony Brook. We had 3 coaches that were tenured when I was there. Of the 3 sports, none of them were really, as I would say, excelling. So we had to make a change. But so when you make a change in a tenured head coach of a high-profile sport, that person's making a significant salary. You have to reallocate that person within the department, but you have to also then find the funding to hire a new coach and probably double or triple that salary, right? So, and then you have a disgruntled employee that is within the athletic department that's probably hurting you as you turn your back. So there's a tenured aspect to it in some institutions. Secondly, there's a union issue, right? You don't just walk in and fire people. 3, there's an aspect of an accountability aspect where you sit down and we do performance reviews every year. It was very important to us. In my 11 years at Stony Brook, I never had one performance review. I had one, and that was the last month I was on the job. So, like you said, you really need to have a situation where you set goals, visions, you set expectations, and you hold the staff accountable. Putting them on contract is a constant reminder that there's an end date, and we all have end dates on our contracts. Ultimately, there's really no job that's a lifetime job. You can be Mike Krzyzewski. If something happens that's dramatic within that program, Mike Krzyzewski can lose his job. Believe it or not, and you see it across the board. Joe Paterno was a great example. I mean, who would ever think, 15 years ago, Joe Paterno would go down, that situation would go down the way it did. Nobody is not vulnerable. Everybody is vulnerable. There's nobody that is not untouchable anymore. And so contracts, I believe people should be on contracts, but I also believe that for being on a contract, you need to hold them to a standard and set goals and expectations and help them reach those expectations and goals. That's what great managers do. And that's what great companies do. They help each other, and we're in this thing together, and I really believe that, and a family. I love how athletic departments and people talk about, welcome to the family. There's no such thing as family in higher education. There's no loyalty with your own family, Troy. If somebody in your family, your sister, your brother, your aunt, your uncle, somebody you love, goes and gets into a car accident because they're drinking and driving, or God forbid breaks the law or something, you love them no matter what. You're not throwing them away. And in college athletics, the institution says, well, that person made a mistake, but we have to protect ourselves. Get rid of them. Don't rehab them. Don't rehabilitate them. Don't help them. Get rid of them, because that hurts our brand. So for me, this notion of family is something I've thought long and hard about. I talked to athletic directors about it and student athletes, because I do a lot of help recruiting student athletes and advocating for kids to get into certain institutions. But the reality is that family is not reality in the public sector. Family is not about blood. It's about who's willing to hold your hand when you need it most. Right? Who's willing to hold your hand? And most colleges and institutions will hold your hand until it affects them either personally as your supervisor or as an institution that could potentially affect your brand. So they'd rather just get rid of you or fire you instead of saying, we're going to support this guy or this woman through this tough time in their life because they made a mistake. It just doesn't happen. So this notion of family I laugh at it when I read the Boston Celtics brought on two. I laughed about this summer. Brad Stevens made a comment, or Danny Ainge made a comment about they brought on 2 new guys to the team in free agency, and it was great. I think it was David Lee might have been one of them, and I loved it. And the quote was, "We want to welcome David Lee and Joe Blow to the 76ers. To the Celtics family." That family. If David Lee If you can get better for David Lee by trading David Lee the next day, you would trade David Lee the next day to get a better player to replace David Lee. That's not family. You don't trade your family members. You support your family members. So that is just a microcosm of sports in general. If you could trade up, most people will trade up and will move you to the side. If you make a mistake that's going to affect them in their role as either athletic director or vice president or president, if it's going to affect their pension, their career, you are dispensable. So it's just this notion of family is comical when it comes to higher ed, because it's $1 billion operation and people make $1 billion decisions to help their brand or so it doesn't get hurt, or your own personal brand, because you may want to be the next athletic director at Penn State, or you may want to be the next president at Cornell, or whatever the case may be. That's the reality we live in. So to get the notion of that we're a family in higher education is really not true. People can talk about it, romanticize it, but the reality is that you're dispensable.